Nero's mother had. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The first husband of Nero's mother, yes. His mother was Agrippina the Younger, and she was a piece of work. Learn a lot about her tonight because she plays prominently in the story of Nero's life. Here is a summary, and this is right out of Wikipedia, but a lot of the information in it comes from Tacitus, who was among the many writers about Nero's life in the 1st and 2nd century, was the one that was perhaps the most frank and also didn't seem to lean one direction or the other in terms of either unduly favoring or unduly smearing Nero, because there was a lot of, let's say, animosity around Nero's life created by those around him, including some of the historians. And then there were others who wanted to garner his favor, and they would write favorably about him. So Tacitus seems to be fairly balanced in what he writes. Okay, so this is what the balanced Tacitus has to say about her. Agrippina has been described by modern and ancient sources as a ruthless, ambitious, and domineering woman who used her powerful political ties to influence the affairs of the Roman state, even managing to successfully maneuver her son Nero into the line of succession. Claudius eventually became aware of her plotting, but died in AD 54 under suspicious circumstances, potentially poisoned by Agrippina herself. All right. So this is our introduction to Agrippina, and let me tell you a little bit more about her. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus Caesar. Her father was Germanicus, who was a Roman general. He was also a nephew and then adopted son and heir apparent to Tiberius. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the daughter of Augustus. She was the sister of Caligula and the niece and 4th wife of Claudius, her 3rd husband. Okay, so to say that she was well connected is a bit of an understatement, isn't it? She is right at the center of Roman royalty. After Agrippina likely poisoned Nero's stepfather, her second husband, her first husband, she married her uncle Claudius. I'm sorry. I'm getting my husbands tangled up. Her first husband died. She married again. She likely poisoned her second husband so that she could marry Claudius and put her son in line for succession. How's that? Claudius adopted Nero and made him his heir. I guess he valued his life, I don't know. And at the time when Claudius was beginning to favor his own son over Nero, he too was poisoned. So, of course, people generally assume that Agrippina was involved, and there's plenty of reason to believe that. Nero's reign as emperor. Ascension to the throne. He became emperor at the age of 16 after Claudius's death in 54 AD. He was heavily influenced by several people that were placed around him by his mother. First of all, Seneca, who was a Stoic philosopher, very famous. You've probably heard of the philosopher Seneca. And he was Nero's personal tutor. He was also under the protectorate of the Praetorian Prefect. Now, the Praetorian Guard, of course, is the Roman Royal Guard, and the Prefect was, at first, was just the captain of the guard, which was high enough in rank, but over time, this position also had a lot of political clout attached to it, apart from the fact that he was the Roman general. He was also closely tied into the royal family. And then, of course, his mother, Agrippina herself. So the three of these were largely responsible for influencing him in his early life. And so his early role he seems to have done well as an administrator under the counsel of his mother and his protectorate. He showed, however, an unseemly affinity for the arts, not befitting his social standing. So he liked to act, and he liked to sing, and he liked to play in public, and that was not acceptable to the aristocracy. They didn't like him for that reason, and that was a long-standing battle he had with the aristocrats. As he took on more personal control, his administration deteriorated. And that was necessary because people around him started dying pretty quickly. As he grew older, he distanced himself from his advisors. He began engaging in erratic and extravagant behavior. He was abandoned by the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and every part of the aristocracy. He essentially made an enemy out of everyone that was close to him. Now, some of the historians say that the people really adored him in some ways because he had a certain populism about him, and yet all of the leadership, by the time he had come of age, had turned against him. His taxation policies made him the enemy of the provincial rulers. So even outside of Rome, the rulers of Rome were against him because he taxed people to death for his extravagant building projects. So decline, downfall, and death. Here are some contributing factors. He executed rivals and family members, including his mother. So the poison lady finally got killed herself. He continued his inordinate love of acting and singing and alienated the elite. His heavy taxation and financial mismanagement increased his unpopularity. And finally, to his demise, a series of revolts and rivals to the throne weakened his rule. He was denounced as public enemy by the Senate, and he learned that about the time he died. He sought protection from the guard, only to find that they had abandoned him. He sought asylum in the homes of his friends, but when he showed up at their houses, he found their houses empty. Facing imminent capture and execution by the Senate, he fled Rome, but for lack of safe haven, he went back there. He couldn't find any place to go where he would be safe. He couldn't board a ship for fear it would sink. He couldn't go to any of the local provinces for fear he'd be caught. The Roman Senate was after him, so all he could do is return, and did find a home of a friend who lived about 4 miles from his palace, who kept him, who took him in, but then he was encouraged to commit suicide. Now, it's uncertain whether he actually killed himself or whether his personal secretary was forced by him to kill him, was commanded by him to kill him. But in any case, you could say he committed suicide. And that was in 68 AD. Now remember, Paul died somewhere around 65, 66. So this is shortly after the Apostle Paul was killed by Nero. So Paul was killed toward the end of his life, at the time when he had already left his bearings and had gone off the deep end. His legacy was the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He was the last of the descendants of Julius Caesar to sit on the throne. His death led to the year of 4 emperors, so threw the country into a lot of chaos at the end of the dynasty. Who's the successor? They don't really have one, so everyone who thought they had some kind of claim to the throne threw their hat in the ring. And so there was a period of 1 year of intense civil war that followed. He had a reputation for tyranny and for controversy in his life and in his death. And he was infamous, of course, among early Christians, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. He's likely the subject of some portions of the book of Revelation, regardless of when you think the book of Revelation was written. There seem to be some pretty clear references to Nero. Some people think that he is the 666, that he wore the mark of the beast. Okay, persecution of Christians. There was a great fire in Rome under his administration in AD 64 that was purportedly started by Nero himself. Now, there were a lot of reasons to think that Rome could easily catch fire. Apparently, a lot of the businesses and homes throughout the city were made of wood and stored flammable materials. That's a no-no, isn't it, Brett?
Yes. And even a better part.
But in any case, he blamed and persecuted Christians as the scapegoats for the fire. So that tended to make people further think that he might have set that fire himself. Some people say he set the fire as a backdrop for a play he was participating in. Don't know whether that was true or not, but that was one of the rumors, one of a number of rumors that circulated around the time of the fire. This began a widespread persecution in Rome and its surrounds. So at this time, you'll be seeing letters from Paul to the Romans, to the Corinthians, telling them to beware of the persecution that's going to come down upon them and how to handle that persecution. Not only Paul writes extensively about persecution, but Peter too. He tortured and executed Christians by throwing them to the beasts, sometimes crucifying them, sometimes burning them alive. It was reported in some quarters that he actually impaled Christians and covered them with a flammable substance so that he could burn their bodies as torches to light the city at night. About the Apostle Paul himself, Paul was twice imprisoned in Rome under Nero. The first was early in Nero's reign in 59 to 61, and most people believe that he was let go and was imprisoned a second time late in Nero's reign, 64 to 65, and of course this is when Nero had brought this intense persecution on Christians all over the provinces and especially in Rome proper. Paul was traditionally martyred under Nero in about 65, and his letters reflect the danger that Christians faced in the Roman Empire. And I'm just going to put up some passages here. Here are 4 that would have probably been before Paul's first imprisonment, four writings that would have been before his imprisonment. Acts, of course, was written by Luke, and it records as sort of the last paragraph in the book of Acts, chapter 28, you see Paul in prison in Rome, sort of under house arrest in Rome. 2 Thessalonians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, all probably prior to his imprisonment, but already talking about Roman persecution of Christians. His first imprisonment, these are the books that were probably written during his first imprisonment in Rome. So Philippians, I've got several passages up there that show basically that most of the first chapter of Philippians, much of the book of Ephesians and Philemon also talk about persecution of Paul, or persecution of Paul. Paul is a prisoner, or things that are happening to Christians. Colossians chapter 4, verse 10 also. And then during his second imprisonment, we have 2 Timothy, which much of chapters 1 and 2 has to do with Roman persecution. And then his death in 65. And here's a quotation from 2 Timothy 4, chapters 6 through 8. And now after thinking about what we just heard about Nero, think about these words again in a new light. So this was Paul right before the time of his death. For I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, and not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing. makes those words just jump right off the page, doesn't it? The Apostle Peter. 1 Peter alludes throughout the letter to Christian suffering under Nero's persecution. Tradition, fairly compelling tradition, holds that Peter was crucified in Rome during Nero's rule. Now I know that so because there is the Catholic assertion that Peter was the first pope, and so there was later on in Catholic history, there was a desire to establish papal succession from Peter through all of the popes of Rome. There are assertions that are made that are not historical, and some of which accumulated from early traditions, and some of which just seem like an attempt to connect Peter to the established pope as the first pope by succession. That notwithstanding, there is a fairly compelling group of traditions, and the reason they're compelling is because because there are so many early traditions and cited traditions before the earliest of writings of others. So, for example, Tertullian might write decades later about something that Polycarp had said or that someone else had said about Peter being in Rome. And there are just enough of those that, in my judgment, just having looked at the list of all of the people who wrote about his having appeared in Rome and having been crucified in Rome, it seems to me to make a pretty strong case. But because of that, there's some backlash, and some people saying, well, you can't prove that Peter was in Rome. And that's true. You can't prove that Peter was in Rome, but it does seem likely. Okay, so his first letter was written probably in the early 60s as the Neronian persecution was ramping up. In 1 Peter, you can just see, again, throughout the letter, are references to persecution and how to view persecution. And in fact, you could say that there's a theology of persecution there. Peter's theology on persecution was the same as that taught by Jesus. He said, don't look at the fiery trials that are happening to you as though something surprising were going on. And he further said that when you're persecuted, you become like Jesus, your master, who was also persecuted. And so you should take it joyfully, and that you should respond to it with a sense of honor that you're being allowed to mimic the master. And if you'll recall that Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount said, rejoice and be exceeding glad, because this is the same way they persecuted the prophets that were before you. So Jesus also, hailing back to an earlier time, said, you're following in a grand tradition of persecution. So anytime persecution happens to you, you should take it that way. You should take it as an honor. Doesn't seem joyous at the moment, but let's face it, you're following after you're in good company, as they say. So what do we learn from the life of Nero and his persecution of Christians?
He was sick.
He was a sick man, yes he was. In fact, there was one historian who said, and I can't quote him exactly, but something to the effect that Nero wasn't motivated by some warped sense of justice, but he just was a cruel man. And to be fair, if you can be fair to Nero, growing up with everyone around you being poisoned, who was a threat to your throne, and your mother poisoning people so to get you on the throne, and then having to kill your own mother and to have to live with it's a wonder if the guy wasn't crazy. He probably didn't grow up, or didn't mature to adulthood around anyone of his own family. Most everyone had been killed or banished.
You know, as you were citing Tacitus, you know, I think Tacitus goes on to say, you know, that things that are just outrageous, you know, even to Roman citizens. So having barges on full-bodied water there in Rome and forcing their aristocratic women to serve basically prostitutes on those barges and you know, forcing men in his company to be so subservient and do outrageous things. And I think it is Tacitus that notes that Christians were put on post and set up or sewn up in the skins of wild beasts and fed to lions, and it's just, you know, outrageous. And yet, as you noted, First Peter gives us something that I think is very difficult for us to swallow. And I think it's even difficult in a world where, as much as we've made us like this leader or that leader, we don't have anybody who's anywhere near Nero, because Peter says things like, honor the emperor. And he knows who, this is who he's talking about. And yet, you know, and yet Revelation, as you noted, doesn't, whether it's all a lot about Nero or a little, God, it's a testament that, okay, God hasn't forgotten evil, and God is dealing with it. But we have to leave that to God. And our social media venom, or just our own thoughts and what we say to each other, and this applies to me as much as anybody else, we need to be very careful how we speak about leaders because of what Peter said.
I mean, human beings deserve respect simply because they're image bearers of God, right? But when somebody's placed in a position of authority, the scriptures clearly tell us that we're to honor them because of that position of authority above the way we would honor other people. That's a tough pill for us as Americans to swallow because we like to be out there with our opinions about political things. And when we see somebody who's abusing their power, well, man, do you think these guys didn't abuse their power?
Well, and you see too, you know, that when Paul was appearing before Agrippa, you know, Agrippa wasn't a model of morality.
Yeah.
And yet, he respects his authority, appeals to him, but partly his appeal is to him, but his appeal is also influential to those around him. And Paul doesn't say much particularly about what he said to Nero. He notes that he appeared for him and stood alone. But he also notes that the gospel had reached people even in Nero's household.
Yeah.
And so, again, we have to think about what is our influence and how we speak toward the people who hear us.
Yeah. We have a pretty wide variety of approaches in Scripture, don't we? I mean, you have Stephen's pretty scathing approach against the Jewish leadership that he was speaking to that got him stoned. Paul just seemed to navigate these higher-ups with just a lot of grace and gentility that would be hard to muster when you know your neck is on the line. But certainly, Paul, as we pointed out on Sunday morning, when smitten in the mouth, quickly turned from calling the person who commanded him to be smitten a whited wall to saying, "Oh, sorry, I didn't know he was the leader of the people. I didn't know he was the high priest." So he had a tremendous amount of respect for even the Jewish leadership that he had at times excoriated for, and that Jesus had excoriated for their hypocrisy.
I think I'm no professional psychologist, but part of what I could see that abuse of power came from. You know, as a child, like you said, you see his mom do these cruel things. So you see her abuse of authority or what she could do. But then also him feeling suppressed and what he genuinely liked to do, that being artistic, the being wanting to act and sing and having to suppress, I guess, who he quote truly was. That this was his way of, well, now I'm in power, I can do what I want. So it was just like a complete turn. And because you see some weird things that he did as abuse. Like, who would have thought to light Christians on fire and use them as torches at his dinner parties? I mean, that's a pretty artistic, awful way to think. But I feel like that kind of went along with it, along with bad, sinful influences in his life.
Think about the outcome of the life of Hollywood stars who become stars when they're children. Now think about one of those people and put them make them president. Or not president, because there are checks and balances in the system. Make them king, make them dictator. What do you get? Unsurprising that these people were decadent and self-serving and cruel and saw themselves as being so high above everybody else, because in a sense of speaking, they were untouchable. The only people that could get to them were the Praetorian Guard or the Senate. And then the Senate had to turn the Praetorian Guard against them. So you take some of these, spoiled Hollywood types and turn them into despots, and you get a Caesar. And these kids, you just can't imagine with what kind of, what their upbringing must have been like. If anybody's ever watched the movie The Last Emperor, referring to the Emperor of China, how he was raised as a child, commanded one of his servants to drink green paint, and his servant just turned it up and drank it and then just dropped dead. That was the kind of power that these people had from the time that they were old enough to speak. Yeah, so it's unsurprising that these are some messed up people. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting that we got to remember, though, that as bad as Nero was, and of course other people throughout history, is God still used it for His glory, and the church was growing at this particular time, and that's what we got to remember. That if it happens to us in our lifetime, God's still going to prove it to His glory and the spread of Christianity. I'll let you go on.
Thank you. Nice segue. Nero's reign in the 60s was typified by arrogance, personal demise, and the end of the Julian dynasty, and it resulted in the rapid spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, even while it was under such intense persecution. Because what happens when you drive Christians further underground? Man, it spreads like wildfire underground. People have often thought to suppress Christianity, but it never works out the way they plan. Domitian in the 90s was a Roman emperor who was typified by autocratic rule. He died by assassination. He was, up to that point in time, the most cruel against Christians of all the Roman leaders. And what happened? The rapid spread of Christianity under Domitian. Diocletian, in the 280s to early 300s, was the most rabid persecutor of Christianity. His rule ended in civil war, was the end of the emperor cult. There was no more emperor worship after Diocletian, and the ascension of Constantine the Great, who would turn Rome into a Christian, quote-unquote Christian nation. Suppressing Christianity the whole way. And this is what you get.
That's a good lesson. of, you know, I have ways I want things to work out.
I'm sorry?
I said, it's a list of part way. I have ways I want things to work out. And that doesn't entail people like Nero
Yeah.
being in for division or evacuation. It certainly is appropriate to pray that those kind of people won't be about or that they might be removed. But, and, you know, I may have come in recent years to the realization that instead of expecting God to get involved with my ideas how to work out, I need to get on board with how He's working out, even if that's not the way I would like it to be.
And whether or not America gets to participate in the fruits. You know, because nations rise and fall. But the purpose of God and the, you know, we tend to think of Christianity and America going together. That's less and less true. And I'm telling you, in the future, there's going to come a day when they are completely decoupled. America will fall and Christianity will continue. So we need to spread the gospel as far as we can. People have asked me, are you sad that you can't do your work abroad anymore? And I tell them yes and no. Yes and no. The blood of Christians is seed. Tertullian, AD 197, between Domitian and Diocletian.
It's interesting, Darrell, when you brought up some of what Peter said in 1 Peter and chapter 2, and I'll just read parts of it, but 1 Peter 2, beginning in verse 13, and I'll jump a few verses, but in 13 it says, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution. And then if you go to verse 15, for such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bond slaves of God. In verse 19, for this finds favor. In verse 20, for what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. And so it's like that quote that you had up there. The blood of Christians is seed. When there was the biggest persecution, Christianity continued to spread. And it's not that we're doing our own will. We're doing the will of God by being who He's called us to be, to put to silence the foolishness of men, like Nero and Diocletian, and whoever else has followed and who will continue to follow until the end of time. And so you see the beauty of what God has laid out, where He talks about, I use the foolishness of men to prove them wrong.
I heard a quotation not long ago, and you know, the art of originality is the ability to forget where you heard something. I'd love to be able to give it proper attribution, but I can't tell you who it was that said it. But that Christianity is like an instrument. If you hand it to a 4-year-old, you'll get one kind of version of it. If you hand it to a master, you'll get another version of it. And so whether we play it well or whether we play it poorly, it's in the instrument itself that the ability to make beautiful music lies. Now, if you get a wonderful instrument placed in the hands of a master, then you have something really, truly beautiful. And so we're different people, and we're going to play that instrument well or we're going to play it poorly, but Christianity goes on. Well, that's all I have on my slides, which means that I didn't gauge my time particularly well, but we also haven't had a lot of time in this class. We haven't had any extra free sessions just to talk. So we got about 8 minutes to make up for all that. Yes, Brother Underwood.
There is a difference between being crazy and being evil.
Mm-hmm.
And the respect that we're to show does not mean that we are to obey the evil that they put forth. I can still have respect, but what we just read there from Peter indicates that I'm not to go along with evil. I'm to stand against it. And that's going to bring persecution from the very ones that we say we're supposed to have respect for. So I think we're oftentimes overdue the word respect. Respect does not mean obedience necessarily.
We are told to submit to the authorities. Okay, so a guy asked me one time, so what about Christians going to war? What does the Bible teach about that? Just because Christianity, just because God has approved and ordained government, the idea of government, and even governments in particular, doesn't mean that God gives a nod to everything that governments do, right? And he certainly didn't approve of everything that Caesar did, right? I don't think anybody would argue that God approved of what Nero did when he burned Christians, okay? So we have to make a distinction between the idea of government standing up for its people and protecting its people against whatever outside influences and evils might befall them. The idea of order as opposed to chaos. These are ideas that are ordained by God. But if called upon to act in a certain way because the government told you so, like giving a pinch of incense to Caesar and saying only Caesar is God, as under Diocletian, there were a lot of Christians that lost their life over that because they refused to obey Caesar. So that doesn't answer the question, should Christians go to war? Maybe it depends on how godly you think the war is. Maybe it depends on how godly the nation is that you're defending or fighting for.
Or against,
Pardon?
or possibly against,
Or against, yes.
although that's a very hard judgment for us to make in the absolute sometimes.
It is. It's hard. And we don't even know the reasons why we're going to war sometimes. So to what extent do you blindly follow your government and do what they tell you to do in that regard? There was a generation where that totally would have happened, but there was more trust in the government at that time to do so, wasn't there? My father went to war unquestioningly because he thought he was fighting against something evil and he was going to get called up whether he volunteered to go or not. He and all of his brothers went into the military service in World War II. So it's not, sometimes they're not easy answers for Christians, but these are the kinds of questions that we have to struggle with and be satisfied in our own minds that we're doing the will of God in whatever we do, whether going to war or refusing to go to war. Julia, go ahead.
Okay, I do think, because we do grapple with this, it's not easy to decide when to not obey, when we have to be called to submit. But I think looking back at the Old Testament, too, is helpful when we see at times when Israel went in captivity, we see them go into Babylonian captivity. And they were told, you go, you obey, you submit.
Yes.
And, we have the beautiful story of how Mordecai worked within the law and how Esther worked within the law. And so, I think looking back at various times in Israel's history is also a clue,
Yeah.
or different clues.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think we have a lot of clues back there. The Lord told them when they went into Babylon
He did. And Babylon was ruthless.
assimilate and do well and support them. Yeah. Who was it over here?
I was gonna say all through scripture, one nation, for one reason or another, has been fighting, whether we as Christians were taking over a piece of property because God said that's the promised land, take it. You know, I mean, all through scripture there's war.
Yeah. Of course, that's pre-Christian because Christ hadn't come yet at the time they were living under the law of Moses. But yeah, there were times when God told them to take land, and brutally so in some cases. And this is, again, one of those big questions that causes some people to turn against the idea of Christianity altogether. How could God demand that sort of a thing from his people? I have a 20-minute answer to that question, and I don't have time to give it right now. Gloria? Oh, I thought I saw you.
The book of Daniel is interesting because he gives, you see Daniel going, you know, there are things that he goes, I'm a win. And there are things that he says, okay, you're fine. One thing we got to be careful though is how we speak about fears. Second, that we don't think because a rumor does evil over here, now we have been validated and disobey over here. You know, that
Yeah. Thank you. On Sunday, we have our last class. The topic is Titus. Now, we're going to be mostly talking about Titus before he was emperor, at the time he was a general, and fought the Jewish war, beginning in AD 66 and ending with the destruction of the temple in AD 70. We will probably also finish early. I don't want to wear him out. I want to, again, illuminate Scripture by talking about him. So come with topics that you'd like to talk about, things or people that you'd like to discuss that we haven't talked about up to this point in time, or if you want to dive a little deeper into some of the things we have talked about, we can feel free to do that too. So I'll probably plan on taking up about half the class session on Sunday to talk about Titus, and the other half we can talk about whatever we like. How's that sound? Thank you.